Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to thank the IHF and Mr. Al-Band, in particular John Curtis and Astrid, on their patience for preparing this conference, which, as conferences, are not very easy things to organize, especially that when people are coming from different parts of the world. We had some visa problems with some of the participants that unfortunately they were not able to come because their visa was rejected. And some of them, other people that we would have liked to have had, couldn't participate because of different reasons and so on. But this conference doesn't terminate today, as the papers presented will be published in book form, and some of the participants who were unable to come, they will be invited to submit their papers, and they will be included in the publication, and we hope that it will be a comprehensive publication on modern architecture of Iran. Now, going to the subject, I want to give a brief panorama of what has about the differences of the development of modern architecture outside of Iran and inside of Iran. Those of you, I hope, will excuse me because, of course, in the audience, we have some professionals who probably know the history of these things better than myself. And there are some people who are not professionals in this field, but they're interested, so they have to have a global view. So because of the 25 minutes of timing, obviously quite a lot of omissions would have been made and have been made. So the gist of my talk is going to treat a few matters. Firstly, how modern architecture evolved in the West. Sort of a very brief general view. How it evolved in Iran. Who were the main proponents of the movements, both outside and inside of Iran? The postmodern and the globalization era, which we're more or less in that process right now. And I am going to discuss, unfortunately, about the modern architecture of Iran. There's some very, very gross misconceptions of who has been very influential and who hasn't been very influential. And certain people have been sort of very grossly enlarged in their role without really having played a great part in this process. And there are some architects who have been extremely important in this process, and they're hardly ever mentioned in the books, even amongst the professionals and the historians of modern architecture in Iran. And these are revealing things which I think it is very important for history to be aware of. One of the problems with modern architecture in Iran has always been that for some reason or the other, we always think we must have a Persian or an Iranian architecture. This is one of those romantic, whimsical, and unachievable things which has bogged down modern architecture of Iran in the last century. The British don't try to make a British architecture. Have you heard a British architect saying that this is what I've done here, this is British architecture? No, you haven't. But in Iran, some of the architects and some of the clients are they're continuously asking, why don't we have and what is a Persian architecture? Why don't we have a Persian architecture? The French never say, this is a French architecture, and so on and so forth. This is a thing which is a very important factor and a very problematic factor which has affected many architects and the trend of architecture in Iran. Another thing which has been rather derogatory as far as the modern architecture of Iran is concerned is that in our judgment, we either romanticize or because of our connections or because of family relationships and so on and so forth, we dilute things. And our judgments are not always very professional and realistic. And I hope that in my preview of these things, I have tried to be quite unbiased, and I will be criticizing some people, but I will be illustrating their work as well. And I have taken great care to actually present their best illustrations, not to present illustrations which belittles their work. Now, let us start with the... Which one do I press? That one on the right, okay. Thank you. Now, this is a few of the buildings by, I consider, of course, there are a lot of architects in the world who have contributed quite considerably to modern architecture. Obviously, I couldn't name them all here, but I have just mentioned three of the very important ones, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Walter Gropius, each one of them being extremely important in their own concept and in their own ideas. And generally speaking, modern architecture has been the result, in many ways, of we must accept that architecture, being an art, it must have some novelty in it. In other words, copying in art is obviously neither becoming nor it increases the value of a work, even if it is a very good work. And these people, we have two important concepts. The use of steel, glass, and the invention of reinforced concrete in its modern form were the three important elements that in fact led to modern architecture. And the architects involved, and there were not only these three architects, there were quite a few architects who acted and they worked on these things beforehand. But these are sort of the, they've got more or less the laurels. Now you have the glass house on the top left, which is from 1850, which at Kew Gardens, and you see that that is a very modern concept. And the middle top one by Walter Gropius, that is obvious. You see all the factories, even today, that you see in the world, that they follow more or less this thing. And this is obviously a very revolutionary way. Mies van der Rohe worked in steel and glass, the bottom left. And Le Corbusier, of course, was the master of reinforced concrete, created various shapes and forms in this respect. Now, others, we have Oscar Niemeyer in Brazil and Brasilia. We have Frank Lloyd Wright, illustrated on the right. And you see, these are works of anything from 1920s until about 1970s and so on. Now, I want you to note this because the next slides, I'm going to show the Iranian side of that period. And if you see on the top of the page, architecture in Iran, 1920 to 2020, there's a reason for this. I haven't taken the official century of 1900 to 2000, because this epoch, in fact, is the end of the Qajar period. And of course, we're 2016, and I'm sure architecturally nothing exceptional is going to happen in the next 4 years. So I've assumed, so I'll put it up to that. Now, here we have in the 1920s, between 1920 and 1930, in 3 European countries, 3 different architects working, and you see how similar their work, their modern concept of architecture is. There is, on the left, Le Corbusier. This is Villa Noailles by Stevens, French, and Gabriel Govrekian, who was a Turkish Armenian, and he later came to work in Iran as well. And he is one of those few people who, in my opinion, you see, he's on the par with all the, with Le Corbusier, but nobody talks about him. And these are 2 more of his works. And for their time, 1923, These are very revolutionary. They may seem a little dated right now, but they're very revolutionary designs for their time. Now we're coming to Iran. Now, I have the kings on the left and their arms on the right, not as an advert, but in order for you to grasp the period much more easily. And this is the late Qajar period. Unfortunately, both politically, socially, and architecturally, was not a very original or very good period, in fact. There was a lot of decadence in artistic work, and it corresponded both historically and also stylistically. Just as we say that in Britain we have the Victorian period, which was not a very artistically, not a very a great artistic period. The late Qajar period was the same. It was not artistically at all very good. And this is one of the buildings. You see, it's a hodgepodge of all sorts of things with very bad proportions, and whatever they've got they have laid their hands on, they seem to have stuck it somehow or the other on the facade. And this is another example of late Qajar. You see the proportions are very bad. The columns are very fat, they're very short. There's the tile work and the ceramic work is very understandard, and so on and so forth. This is another example of late Qajar. This has, of course, won the UNESCO Renovation Prize, but it doesn't mean that architecturally it is of great value. But obviously they did a very excellent restoration work onto it. Now here we come a little further. This is the municipality building by Markov. Now Markov was an Armenian, Iranian architect, and another person who is not very much talked about, but he has been a very, very important element in the promotion of modern architecture of that period. And some of his work have been very important as far as it goes. This concept of having an Iranian architecture has created a big problem throughout these last 100 years in Iran, that they have been trying in some ways, or nearly always, also going back and having a neo period of architecture. Now this is a sort of the municipality, and this is more or less a neo-European design. It's not a very original design. But the proportions and so on are quite well worked out. Now this is the old telecommunication building of Tehran. Of course, this is a neo-European architecture. You see very similar to the palace in Belgium and so on and so forth. But extremely well, very well proportioned building. And I will be coming back to this later. This, of course, has been demolished. Now, this is the telecommunication building that you saw previously, which was demolished, and this is the new building by Aziz Farmanfarmayan, one of those pillars of modern architecture because of his family connections and because of his own personality and so on. But a lot of these people, Aziz Farmanfarmayan, Furughi built a Bank Melli branch in the Hassanabad Square, one of the most fantastic squares of Tehran, and he ruined that, that square. So we have to be frank and mention these things. Very rarely these things are mentioned. And Seyhun, he demolished quite a few, I will be showing them to you, quite a few historic monuments, and they rebuilt new edifices of very, very ordinary standards, such as this. This, of course, everybody knows is the Ferdowsi. But you see, I'd like you especially put all the dates in these, because you'll see that these are all neoclassic, either neoclassic Achaemenian, neoclassic Sasanian, neoclassic European, neoclassic something or the other. And while in Europe, you saw those examples of modern architecture all over Europe, they were greatly advanced. This is another one of these neo buildings at the Reza Shah time. They're very nicely done. This one must admit, the proportions are very good. The ensemble is quite good and so on, but nevertheless, they're not original architectural works. This is Bank Melli, of course, and this is the post office, which is sort of something more or less neo-Achaemenian and neo-Sasanian again, and this was in 1934. Well, in 1934 Europe, you saw those examples of very modern architecture that was going on. And this is the famous Godard Museum that I'm sure John knows better than all of us. And this is, of course, this is very obviously a copy of Tisfun and Neo-Sasanian architecture of no architectural merit or value. You have seen, I've shown this before. Now, there are some me'mars in Iran, and they're being very romanticized as well. Some of them might have been quite good, but some of them created quite atrocious monuments, and this is an example of this. This is the Shah Reza Hospital, and you see it's a collection of Takht Jamshid columns and various tile works. There's some non-entity columns and decorations and so on. These you know well. It's very interesting that this Gouverkian, who we saw, he was on the par in his European work, on the par with Le Corbusier. He was invited for a few years to Iran for some buildings and so on. And he didn't exert that originality and that sense of modern architecture at all in his Iranian work. Whether this was, he wanted this, or whether he was sort of forced to adhere to the political whim of the authorities, we don't know. But anyhow, the resultants are not in the same standard of his own work. This is Bashgah Afsaran, the Officers Club, again by him. And this as well is not in the same standard of his usual work. This is the first radio transmitter in Tehran in 1940. So as you see, in the 1940s, even later, that we were still carrying on with this traditional type of architecture in Iran, while the rest of Europe and some parts of the United States were much ahead of us. Now, one of the architects who has been perhaps the most influential in modern architecture of Iran is Hovhanessian. And this type of architecture you see all over Tehran and Iran, even more or less up to today. And he has been a very, very important contributor to modern architecture, that very little of him is said. And this building, and Mohsen Foroughi, who did very little. He was a collector of ancient relics, and he was fantastic in that sense. But as an architect, his name appeared in lots of places. And he is an old friend of my father's, and he was a good friend of mine. But I know that Mohsen Foroughi very rarely put pencil to paper. And a lot of the works which are attributed to Mohsen Foroughi, I will show you later, they are in fact not his work, but his name is on them. And this is another one of those things. This is again, and this is a 1941 a commercial center in Tehran. And you see, this is 1951, the Radio Tehran transformed. But it's more or less, in other words, about in 30 years at least behind from what that Gropius work that you saw. And this is Kagh Niyavaran, and at the bottom by Aziz Farmanfarmayan, and that is the Presidential Palace by Oscar Niemeyer. Now, you see that this is this could be a very ordinary house anywhere in the world, and it's has neither the character of a palace nor of any architectural merit. This is by Amanat. Of course, you all know this. And this again is a neo-Achaemenian and in some parts Sasanian work. And this has always bugged down until that we get to it. The new generation of architects in Iran are beginning to get rid of this, which is a very good sign. This is the theater. Again, this is this church. This is a neo-church as well. a neo-European church built in Tehran, cathedral in Tehran. Now, these are the works, some of the works of Furughi. An architect couldn't, it's very difficult, especially for those of us who are architects, to think that the same person has designed these three buildings. So this is, I think, is a very good evidence of the thing that Furughi himself was not actually the designer of a lot of his buildings. These are the works by Aziz Farmanfarmayan. Aziz, several times, he admitted to me that he doesn't design his buildings. He had a big organization, he had, and often he employed, or he made partnership with architects like Nader Ardalan and so on and so forth, who designed for him. But very rarely he designed himself. And this is another case that you see, these are very different. Of course, that thing in front of the post thing, that was done after the revolution. That has nothing to do with Aziz. And these are some of the works of Seyhun. Now, none of these are works which are done up to about 1970s. And these have really no architectural merit. And some of them, this Nader monument is rather Germanic and Hitlerian, in fact, in its presentation. Now, this was the old Baba Taher monument, which was demolished, and on the right was the new edifice which is built. That was the old Avicenna monument, and that is the new one which was built in its place. And us Iranians, unfortunately, we are experts in destroying our own heritage, unfortunately. And I'm very sorry to say this in the Iran Heritage Foundation, which is doing all its best to preserve this great heritage. But unfortunately, we really must do a lot to stop this kind of work. And these are the architects, three of the architects who are considered as the pillars of modern architecture. And they've destroyed several very important monuments in that country. This is the entrance to Tehran University. Very simple, but very original and very important contribution. And nobody is talking about this young architect who designed this. This is another Armenian architect. This is a little chapel in Vanak. Fabulous work of art. Very original, very well proportioned, extremely well executed. And another person, this Mr. Voskanyan, who died recently in Los Angeles, he has been a great contributor of modern architecture in Iran, and this is a fabulous example of his work. Of course, we come to after the revolution. After the revolution, we have some monuments like this, which is not a very, architecturally, not a very distinguished example. But this concept of, I'm getting near the end, this concept of having an Iranian architecture, fortunately, is diminishing in the postmodern architecture of Iran. And lot of the new young architects, they are not bogged down by this concept of let us have an Iranian or a Persian architecture, that none of us knows what that is or what could be, and it's not achievable. This is another one of these new architecture. You see, this is neither neo or anything. I'm not saying it's a very good architecture, but at least they're not trying to push a Persian or Iranian concept. Now, certain monuments have become well-known and famous and landmarks. And becoming a landmark doesn't necessarily mean that this is a very good architecture. A cartoonist, you'll see in the middle, has cleverly depicted the Tehran Tower as a hubble bubble. And I have put these 4 monuments which have become symbolic of these cities. The one in London, you know, by a very well-known architect, but not, in my opinion, a great architecture at all, which is gradually becoming a symbol of London. On the left bottom, of course, you have the New York example and the Iranian examples. Thank you very much for your attention.